Welcome to week 3 of session 2, EDU 536. This week we're going to focus on the evidence of learning, which is in the stage 2. And as I've been looking through, those of you that have submitted your kind of plan or your outline for your unit planning, it looks like we're getting some really good ideas. Also noticing just kind of some general things that maybe you can mention here, that some of us need to be, as we are thinking and moving forward in this, and I wrote this in the comments, thinking about some more specific things in terms of what is the evidence. So we might have put, this is how we're going to assess it, but really what is it we're actually looking for? So that's an important part in any unit that you plan. And I noticed that several of you have mentioned in the discussion that it's been a long time since you've made a unit plan, and I would agree with that. However, with having new courses this year and with the new standards that have come out, I've been forced to do some planning and unit creation of my own, which I'm sure some of you are figuring out and getting through. So hopefully the presentation here today, this week, will help you in understanding what that evidence is that we're looking for. And so we want to start by talking a little bit about just the review of what transfer was from last week. And some questions you can ask yourself is when you're teaching and thinking about transfer is how do you know that? How do you know that students, or you, and these questions are asking you to kind of reflect on yourself as a teacher. How do you know when you've taught something that's transferred? Did it show up right away? Was it something that showed up, several weeks into it? Was it something that showed up, maybe you had them in 8th grade and they come back as seniors and maybe it's showing up there. And then you think about some other times that maybe you should have taught something that transferred, or you thought you did teach something that transferred that maybe it didn't. And so when you're thinking about those learning evidences, transfer goals require you to have application, that students can take the learning and the knowledge, not just the knowledge, but the understanding of that knowledge, and apply it to a new and novel situation. And that's what we're talking about just in our review here. So our hope for this week is that you're going to be able to get some evidence needed for your unit goal, develop appropriate criteria for your stage 2, create some rubrics or proficiency scales if you're an SBG, SRG school district that you're going to incorporate into your evaluation criteria, as well as developing some performance tasks that incorporate authentic tasks, which we often think of as kind of hands-on learning. And then are you able to align those assessment with your unit goals, which again goes back to the UBD umbrella of planning from backwards, right? Planning backwards. So those are kind of the things that we're hoping you're able to do when we get done with this understanding of this week through our discussion posts, through our work towards improving our plans, our unit plans, especially in stage 2. All right, so the biggest understanding of when you're thinking about evaluating students and assessing students is understanding how am I going to see what they know or where they learned that from, or what am I trying to guide that instruction, that teaching towards. And so oftentimes our minds are wired to look for meanings of patterns, to organize things like concepts, facts, and experiences. Oftentimes we think about those through these big ideas, these big understandings, these essential questions. Oftentimes as a teacher and a peer coach, when I walk around to classrooms and I watch other people teach, I a lot of times hear teachers say things like, these are the big takeaways today, or when you leave so-and-so's classroom and somebody asked you, what did you learn in chemistry today? I want you to be able to say, these were the things that were the focus of our learning. And so what we've really done in my district, and I'm sure in a lot of districts, we've really kind of changed that language to, these are some of the big ideas, to here are the essential questions. Here are our learning targets. And that's something that I think most districts are making that change too. And if not, at least in your classroom to help students understand that, okay, essential questions, as I've mentioned before, are kind of this umbrella, larger full unit questions. And then our learning targets are more day-to-day I can statement sort of things. And that's where we're going to focus some of the presentation today on. So big ideas can be questions, as I was referring to before, often called essential questions. What's the moral of your unit? What are the big things you're trying to get from those? The biggest connection you can make is what standard is it tied to? So when you're looking at essential questions and the creation of essential questions, you should be able to look at them and say, this is the standard this directly ties to. this is the portion of the standard it directly ties to with this essential question. Here are the learning targets that are going to enable my students to show me their knowledge or understanding of the essential question. Here's the learning target. Here's the teacher skills or strategies that are going to drive that instruction to allow students to do that. Secondly, students really like to see these essential questions as this kind of big overlapping thing. And as Marzano likes to say, students do better when they understand what the learner outcomes are. And so that's what's going on here. Essential questions, I post them in my classroom. I'm sure there are some other people that do the same thing. It really gives students the opportunity to know what the learning is about. So kind of a review of essential questions, since we did mention those earlier in this presentation, but also earlier, I believe last week, and was also mentioned in the textbook. Essential questions can be overarching, and that's kind of what we were talking about right there. This idea of that umbrella, the kind of cover of what you want students to learn in a unit. They're usually general, they're usually transferable, and an example here in history or social studies, you might say, whose story is this, or what perspective are we looking at? When you're looking at a specific topic in essential questions, so you might have questions in a history class, let's say, that are things like understanding how what was done in the past creates problems and solutions in the future. Now that could be applied to any unit in social studies. But if you're looking at it specifically under a topical thing and your topic is World War II, your question might say something like understanding how the effects of World War II created the Cold War situation in Europe and North America. That's a specific essential question. They don't always have to be transferable when you fit them into these larger units. Yes, the goal is transfer. The goal is having students be able to take the knowledge they gained from an essential question, a specific topic, and apply it to something different. But sometimes it's not the same. It's not transferable. And then an example might be, how did Native Americans view the settlement of their land? So that essential question really isn't something you can take out of the topic on westward expansion and apply it to a topic on the war in Afghanistan. And then also it's important to understand there's not a single correct answer. It's this higher, deeper ordered thinking, as we've mentioned and talked about throughout the unit and throughout the course so far. Okay, so stage one, essential questions, and these are just some reviews. We talked about those things. You've submitted some of your rough drafts and that kind of thing, and so we're going to skip over that in our presentation today, and we're actually going to skip here to stage two assessment, and this is really where we want to spend the majority of our time in this week's presentation, focusing on what evidence are you going to use to show students have achieved both the depth you want them to understand and the breadth of your learning goals. And so it's important that your learning goals aren't surface level, aren't just that recall or memorization level of Bloom's taxonomy, but that deeper level of learning. And then when you decide on your learning goals, how deep are they, how broad are they, you also want to decide what shows me that a student understands this. Those of you that are using SRG or SBG, you probably have things like approaching mastery, master the standard, meets the standard, thorough understanding, those kind of things. But what is it that indicates that? And so this is where things like rubrics, proficiency scales, those sort of things that are guiding students to work through some of these things. If you're a preschool teacher, some of that creative curriculum stuff that you already have that's guiding what you're thinking. And then you want to decide what also means that a student doesn't understand it. And how can I give a student a failing grade or a failing mark if they're not showing me what they know? And the other part of that is this goal of comprehensive assessment. You're trying to create a photo album. So if you think about it this way, in our teaching profession, we all have to have portfolios that have small snapshots of how we meet each of the teaching standards, but it lays into this big portfolio. And the same idea with assessment. You don't want to think of assessment as a small snapshot of, boom, this one standard is here, and this standard is here, and this standard is here. You want to look at it and say, okay, these are the 5 standards that I'm teaching. How are students meeting those? Are they meeting those in terms of understanding what the unit content is? And then once you've done that, you may have to look at it specifically and say, boy, on this one of understanding how the three branches of government work together, they're not understanding that. So what do I need to do to enhance, reteach, create opportunities for students to demonstrate those kind of things? And so it's important to understand that when you're creating a unit, assessment is extremely important in deciding not only teaching strategies, but deciding at what level are students understanding the material you're teaching, and are they understanding it at a level in which is efficient to meet the standard. So when we're talking about understanding and seeing where students are in terms of providing evidence, there's four types of criteria that we often use to determine if a student is meeting the learning standard or learning target. And the first one is content, and that's pretty self-explanatory in terms of understanding and knowledge. We've talked a lot about understanding and knowledge in previous discussions, previous discussion posts, previous presentations, and its most common identifier in terms of students are understanding something. And so there's degrees of understanding and proficiency, and then there's accuracy, correctness, and thoroughness. And those all fit into at what level are students showing that they have a knowledge or an understanding of specific learning targets, learning skills. The second one is process, which is, are students taking the information and making appropriate progress and going through the appropriate progress and process to show learning. Things like being on task, well prepared, collaborative. Oftentimes this criteria is being eliminated from grading when we're talking about standards-based or standards reference grading. A lot of times we're saying these are things that are important to make sure students can do in order to demonstrate an understanding of learning. And some people, I'm sure, are still giving points on things like, are you participating in class? Are you, being an active part of a discussion? But if you're a group of students or school that's using SRG or SBG, the process really is measuring itself, right? It's understanding the process and understanding how that process will lead to the end result you're hoping to get. And that's where that fits into understanding how your students are doing in terms of your learning targets. 3 is the impact. So ultimately, did the process lead to an impact that allowed students to show that they achieved your desired result? Did they achieve the bottom line, or this is what they need to have in order to show proficiency? And then the last thing is the quality. Not only the quality of the work the students turn in, but the quality of the unit and instruction you give them. And so what you're talking about is attention to detail, visual presentations, rigor, originality. Every rubric I have that I create and use in my classroom and proficiency scale has a sense of originality to it. So at what point is the student taking thoughts and information and presentation materials and applying it with their own perspective, their own understanding, so that I'm not getting this regurgitated, this is what I think you want me to know as the teacher, but this is what I truly know, and this is how we can move from what they truly know to building on that to get them to where the learning target is, or to say, wow, you totally understand that, let's differentiate and have you go a little farther yet. And it's important that you have these 4 criteria, but they don't have to all be in the same unit. They don't all have to be necessarily in each lesson within that unit. You get to decide, and that's the great part and the autonomous part of being a teacher, is that when you go above and beyond, you're creating these ideas of how do I know if a student understands something, the evaluative process of understanding that. As a teacher, you get to choose at what point shows mastery of a skill and master of the understanding of what you want them to get from that learning target. And then to kind of close out this part of the presentation, there's some questions that are tied to those criteria in terms of where do I want to go? Which of those 4 criteria do I want to use? Am I going to use all of them? Am I going to assess all of them? And that's another thing that I think is important, is when you're thinking about planning a unit, are you actually grading everything, or are you just assessing and giving feedback? And so with impact, we're saying, was the problem solved? Was the work effective? With content understanding, did it reveal deep understanding? Were they completing the work? The process, was proper procedure followed? Did they work in groups well? And that's not something you're necessarily grading. That's something you're assessing and saying, this is leading to get to that end result. Again, with quality being the same, was it well organized or grammatically sound? And for those reasons, it's important that we have an understanding of exactly what it is that we want our students to do when we're evaluating their learning and understanding of our topic and our learning targets.